In late December of 1977, the President of the United States stood at this incredibly opulent, glittering state dinner in Tehran. He raised his crystal glass, looked the Shah Iran right in the eye, and toasted the country as, quote, an island of stability.
Right, in one of the more troubled areas of the world.
Yeah, exactly. Which is just wild because less than 400 days later, that entire regime, a seemingly unshakable fortress backed by the ultimate global superpower and the CIA, it was entirely erased from the earth.
Completely gone.
So I guess the core question is, how does the greatest intelligence apparatus in the world completely miss the collapse of an entire nation?
It really is, the ultimate historical blind spot.
Yeah.
Because we look at these massive regime-toppling events, and we always want to find a simple, immediate trigger.
Right. We want the spark that blew up the powder keg.
Exactly. We want the earthquake that brought the building down. But when a nation's political structure collapses, it's almost never a sudden earthquake. It is decades of unseen water damage, basically rotting the foundational wood from the inside out.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking you, the listener, on a really intense journey into the Iranian Revolution of 1978 to 1979. We've got this incredibly comprehensive stack of historical texts, declassified accounts, and scholarly analyses that we're going to be unpacking for you today.
And the mission here isn't just to recite a timeline of what happened. Timelines are easy. We want to understand the why.
Right. How did this actually happen? How did a movement that was so diverse and frankly, so fractured, managed to completely upend the geopolitical order of the entire Middle East?
The stakes here really are monumental because, like I said, revolutions are rarely sudden explosions. They're the result of compounding pressure. So to truly understand how this specific revolution succeeded, we're going to examine 4 key variables.
Which are?
The internal and external conditions of the country, the nature of the leadership, the ideological blueprint that guided them, and finally, the ground-level organization that made it all possible.
Okay. And before we get into the weeds, I want to make something very clear to you, the listener. We are unpacking a highly complex historical event here. It involves various political ideologies, intense foreign interventions, deep religious movements.
Very deep.
Yeah. So our job today is strictly to report and synthesize the historical events and viewpoints documented in our source material. We are not here to endorse any political sides. Not the actions of the U.S., the British, the Shah, or the revolutionaries. We're just here to look at the blueprint of how history actually unfolded.
Just the facts as the sources lay them out.
Exactly. So, okay, let's unpack this. Our sources make this really interesting distinction right off the bat about the word revolution itself. They separate a political revolution from a social revolution.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the term revolution just gets thrown around constantly, right? That we talk about the digital revolution, the industrial revolution. But in political science, a basic political revolution is simply the overthrow of an existing regime. It's just a change in leadership. The state apparatus itself remains largely intact.
So it's like changing the driver of a car. You pull the old driver out, you put a new one in, maybe change the radio station, but the car is exactly the same. It's driving on the exact same roads with the same engine.
That's a perfect analogy. And the initial explosion of those purely political revolutions, it tends to sort of fizzle out. Once the new driver's in the seat, things go back to normal.
Well, right.
But what happened in Iran was profoundly different. It aligns with what scholars call a social revolution. And this is a rapid, fundamental transformation of a society's entire state and class structures.
So extending that car analogy, a social revolution isn't just changing the driver. It's like tearing down the car factory entirely, burning the original blueprints, convincing the workforce that the old factory was fundamentally evil, and then building a completely different type of vehicle from scratch.
Yes. And doing all of that while the entire world watches in absolute shock. Revolutions, in this profound sense, are these ongoing, agonizing processes of social transformation. And what's fascinating here is how the Iranian Revolution really mirrors 2 other massive social upheavals of the 20th century.
You're talking about the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the Chinese Revolution in 1949.
Exactly.
When I was reading through the materials, that comparison actually stopped me in my tracks because it's not the first parallel that jumps to mind when you think of an Islamic revolution, but the structural, mechanical similarities are just undeniable.
They share an almost identical life cycle. In Russia, China, and Iran, You didn't just have one unified group rising up with a single cohesive vision. You had this massively diverse, incredibly broad coalition of disaffected masses.
Right, you had liberals, leftists, traditionalists, students, workers. They had almost nothing in common ideologically.
And nothing at all. They were
Yeah.
united solely by what they were against, which was the absolute hatred of the existing monarch or emperor.
So they band together to push the boulder over the cliff. But once the boulder falls, they look at each other and realize they all want entirely different things to take its place.
Exactly. And in all three of those cases, a single, highly organized, uncompromising faction emerges from that chaotic coalition. And they end up devouring their former allies and entirely hijacking the post-revolution trajectory.
Wow.
Yeah. In Russia, Lenin's Bolsheviks rode in on these broad slogans promising peace, land, and bread to everyone. But once the Tsar and the provisional government were gone, they moved rapidly to centralize power. They executed or exiled their liberal and socialist rivals, laying the groundwork for a totalitarian state.
And the same pattern repeats in China with Mao Zedong. You have a massive peasant uprising that overthrows the old order, but it ends with a single faction dominating the state entirely.
Which brings us directly to Iran. The revolution sweeps away the pro-Western, autocratic monarchy of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. It starts as this incredibly diverse movement of Marxists, merchants, secular lawyers, clerics.
But it ends in the absolute triumph of one victorious faction.
Yes, a radical Shia Islamic order led by Ayatollah Khomeini.
But with one massive twist, right? Because instead of using a secular philosophy like, variations of Marxism to advance the change, the dominant faction in Iran utilized a highly specific, deeply historical version of political Islamism to legitimize their takeover.
Right. And to understand how that theology became the ultimate weapon, we have to understand the soil it grew in. Why did Iranians want to tear down the factory in the first place?
Well, to answer that, we have to look at who originally built it, which brings us to the deep history of foreign puppeteering in Iran. And looking at these early historical documents, it just blew my mind how casually global superpowers treated Iran like a piece of property.
Oh, so
I mean, you have a nation known as Persia in the West until 1935 that has this fierce sense of national pride. They inherited it from ancient empires. They have a deep identity rooted in Shia Islam dating back to the Safavid dynasty in the 16th century.
yeah, very rich cultural heritage.
But because of exactly where they are on the map, they become the center of this geopolitical chess match called the Great Game.
The Great Game was this fierce, century-long imperial rivalry between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. Britain wanted to protect its crown jewel, which was India, from Russian expansion. And Russia, meanwhile, desperately wanted warm water ports in the south.
And Iran was caught geographically right in the middle of this imperial collision.
Exactly. And it wasn't just, abstract political maneuvering. In 1907, Britain and Russia signed the Anglo-Russian Convention in St. Petersburg. They literally pulled out a map of Iran and just carved it up.
They actually did that.
Yeah. Russia had recently been humiliated in the Russo-Japanese War, which left them pretty drained financially and militarily. So Britain used that leverage to force an agreement. They drew lines dividing Iran into spheres of influence. The entire northern half, including the capital Tehran, went to Russia.
Oh.
And the southeastern corner, bordering India, went to Britain. The Iranian government itself was left with basically a strip of desert in the middle.
Let me throw an analogy out there for the listener to really capture how enraging this would be to the average Iranian. Imagine you own a massive, multi-generational family estate. You are deeply proud of your family name.
Okay.
But you have two incredibly powerful, heavily armed neighbors. And these neighbors just stroll onto your property, shake hands with each other, and declare that one of them controls the upstairs bedrooms, the other controls the gardens, and you, the actual homeowner, are only allowed to make decisions about the hallway.
That captures the profound humiliation perfectly. It effectively voided Iran's sovereignty. The ruling Qajar dynasty at the time was weak and deeply in debt to these foreign powers, which really thwarted any Iranian attempt to build strong, independent domestic structures.
You were trapped.
Completely. But the humiliation was about to get exponentially worse, because shortly after they divided up the rooms of your estate, they discovered an ocean of gold under your floorboards.
Oil, right at the turn of the 20th century.
Yes. In 1901, a British-born Australian speculator named William Darcy approached the bankrupt Shah and purchased a concession. For a relatively tiny sum of cash and a promise of a 16% share of future profits, Darcy was granted the exclusive rights to prospect for oil across 3/4 of the entire country.
Wait, 3/4 of the entire nation. That's staggering. It's essentially giving away the future of the country for pocket change.
It was. And when massive oil reserves were finally struck in 1908, the British government stepped in. They were desperately transitioning their naval fleets from coal to oil to maintain global supremacy, so they eventually bought out the concession.
Right, and they established the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which later became the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AIOC.
Exactly. For the next several decades, this company exploited Iranian oil almost entirely for the benefit of the British Empire, paying Iran an absolute pittance.
So you have a country where the people are deeply proud of their history, but they're watching foreigners literally siphon their national wealth out of the ground. That constant interference really ingrained a fierce, visceral distrust of outsiders into the very DNA of Iranian political culture.
It created a deep psychological scar. And, there were early attempts to fight back. In 1906, an alliance of the intelligentsia, the traditional merchant class known as the Bazaris and the Shia clerical establishment, forced Asia's first constitutional revolution.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they established a parliament to limit the king's power, but it was continually undermined by British and Russian interference. Those powers much preferred a compliant dictator over a messy independent democracy.
Which leads right into a period of total fragmentation and bankruptcy after World War I. The old monarchy is dying, and into this chaos steps a military man, Brigadier General Reza Khan. He's the commander of the Russian-trained Cossack Brigade. In 1921, he marches his troops into Tehran and simply takes power. By 1925, he deposes the old dynasty entirely, crowns himself Reza Shah, and starts the Pahlavi dynasty.
And Reza Shah is a towering, deeply polarizing figure in Iranian history. He came from a humble background. He was very impressed by the aggressive secular modernization happening in neighboring Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk.
Right.
So Reza Shah believed the only way to save Iran from foreign domination was to drag it, kicking and screaming, into the 20th century.
And he did it with an iron fist. He built massive infrastructure projects, expanded education, and he famously constructed the Trans-Iranian Railway, linking the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea.
Yes, huge modernization efforts.
But at the same time, he suspended the constitution, banned political opposition, and forced Western dress codes. He literally had police tear the traditional veils off women in the streets.
He fundamentally alienated the deeply religious population to appease his own vision of progress. And geopolitically, he tried to play a very dangerous game. In the 1930s, to counterbalance British and Soviet influence, Reza Shah forged very close economic and technical ties with Nazi Germany. Germany actually became Iran's largest trading partner.
Which, obviously in hindsight, is a fatal geopolitical miscalculation.
Absolutely fatal. When the Second World War broke out, Reza Shah declared neutrality. But in 1941, the British and the Soviets, who were now allies, demanded to use the Trans-Iranian Railway. They needed it as a vital supply route to funnel American weapons up to the Soviet Union to fight Hitler.
And Reza Shah, trying to protect his country's sovereignty, refused.
He did. And the response from the Allies was just brutal. They didn't negotiate.
No, they simply invaded.
They occupied Iran, divided it up again along those old imperial lines, and forced Reza Shah to abdicate the throne at gunpoint. They packed him onto a ship and sent him to exile in South Africa, where he eventually died. And then they placed his 22-year-old son, Crown Prince Mohammad Reza, on the peacock throne.
And this is a crucial foundational detail that I think so many people miss. The Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the man who will eventually be overthrown in the 1979 revolution, did not earn his throne. He was placed there by invading foreign armies specifically because he was young, inexperienced, and compliant.
He was acutely aware that he was a pawn. Throughout World War II, the U.S., Britain, and the USSR occupied Iran. They treated it like a transit lounge. They promised to leave 6 months after the war ended, but they basically spent the whole war competing for influence. The Soviets, for instance, backed the Communist Tudeh Party in the north, setting up puppet socialist republics.
Wait, let's pause there for a second. How does a communist party even gain traction in a deeply traditionally religious country like Iran? That seems like mixing oil and water.
It's a great question, and it really comes down to proximity and extreme inequality. The Soviet border was right there, for one thing. But more importantly, look at the oil cities in the south, like Abadan, where the big British refinery was located. Okay, you had tens of thousands of Iranian workers living in absolute squalor in shanty towns without running water or electricity, doing grueling physical labor. And right next door, the British oil executives lived in walled compounds with manicured lawns, swimming pools, and imported whiskey.
Oh, wow. So when a political party comes along and says the foreign capitalists are stealing your labor and your wealth, that secular Marxist message is going to resonate powerfully, even if it totally conflicts with their religious background.
Precisely. Extreme poverty and foreign exploitation are the ultimate fertilizers for radical ideologies. Now, after the war, the Soviets actually refused to leave northern Iran. Stalin wanted to secure the oil fields in southern Russia and argued that a hostile Iran could easily ignite them. It took the intense threat of U.S. and British military retribution, plus some clever Iranian diplomacy, to finally force the Soviets out in 1946.
But that boiling frustration over foreign control, the poverty, and the weakness of the young Shah finally bubbles over in the early 1950s, and a man emerges who tries to take the house back, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh.
Mossadegh is really the crucible of modern Iranian political history. By 1951, he had coalesced a massive rainbow alliance called the National Front. It included secularists, communists from the Tudeh Party, middle-class liberals, and devoutly religious groups led by prominent clerics.
And Mossadegh himself was a highly educated, charismatic, veteran reformist, right? He was of noble origin and had actually been imprisoned by the first Reza Shah for opposing his dictatorial rule.
Yes.
Reading his goals in the source text, it sounds exactly like what a Western democracy would want for a developing nation. He wanted to constitutional monarchy where the Shah was just a figurehead, and most importantly, regain full control over Iran's oil.
This was driven by a deep, almost spiritual moral conviction for him. Mossadegh believed he had an ethical responsibility to empower Iran to be a truly sovereign state. He saw the British monopoly over the Anglo-Iranian oil company not just as, bad business, but as the root of all political corruption and foreign interference in his country.
So he takes action.
Big action. On May 1st, 1951, just after the Parliament voted him in as prime minister, he dropped a bomb on the global geopolitical order. He declared the absolute nationalization of the AIOC.
He effectively told the British Empire, this oil is ours. It is under our dirt. We will compensate you for your equipment. Your engineers can even stay and work for us, but we own the company now.
And the British reaction was sheer panic and outrage. They couldn't accept it, primarily because they feared it would set a catastrophic precedent across the entire Middle East. If Iran could take back its oil, what would stop Egypt from taking the Suez Canal?
Which, ironically, is exactly what happened a few years later.
Exactly.
So Britain responds with economic warfare, classic gunboat diplomacy.
Yes. They deployed warships to the Persian Gulf. They imposed a global economic blockade. British Petroleum and other Western oil companies completely boycotted Iranian oil. They even threatened to sue anyone who bought a single drop of it.
Wow. Which completely choked the Iranian economy. Mossadegh couldn't fund any of his promised reforms. The people suffered widespread economic hardship. Inflation skyrocketed. But Mossadegh absolutely refused to back down.
And this is where Cold War paranoia becomes the driving force of history. The British took their case to the United Nations, but they couldn't get a mandate to invade. So they turned to Washington. Now, the U.S., under President Truman, was actually initially sympathetic to Mossadegh's nationalism.
But then leadership changes.
Right. When President Eisenhower took office, the British changed their tactic. They didn't argue about oil anymore. They argued about the Red Menace. They convinced the CIA that Mossadegh's economically crippled Iran was a fragile domino right on the Soviet border that was incredibly vulnerable to a takeover by the Communist Tudeh Party.
So Britain plays the ultimate Cold War trump card. They basically say, if you don't help us get our oil company back, the Soviets get a warm water port and half the world's oil. Did the U.S. really believe that, or was it just a convenient excuse?
Well, it was likely a mix of genuine, intense Cold War paranoia and, frankly, economic opportunism. But whatever the core motivation was, the result was a covert operation that altered the trajectory of the Middle East forever. In August 1953, the CIA, heavily encouraged and assisted by Britain's MI6, launched Operation Ajax.
Right. They spent millions of dollars bribing Iranian politicians, military officers, and even street gangs. They organized fake communist riots to terrify the religious establishment and then fake religious riots to terrify the secularists. They just created absolute chaos.
And they utilized conservative military elements to storm Mossadegh's residence and overthrow his democratically elected government. The Shah, who had actually panicked and fled to Rome a few days earlier when an initial coup attempt failed, was suddenly flown back to Tehran and reinstalled on the throne as an absolute monarch.
And Mossadegh was put on trial for treason. There is a quote from his defense in our sources that is just heartbreaking. He stood in court and said, "I know that I have committed no more than one sin, and that is that I have not yielded to the whims of foreigners."
That 1953 coup is widely considered the original sin of U.S.-Iran relations. I mean, no Persian ruler had ever succeeded to the throne as a result of a direct, orchestrated, covert operation by foreign intelligence agencies.
Right.
The CIA's involvement became an open secret, and it was deeply, viscerally resented by the public. It fundamentally destroyed the Shah's domestic legitimacy forever. In the eyes of his people, he was no longer an Iranian king, he was an American puppet.
Which brings us to the next massive phase we need to cover, the gilded cage of the 1960s and 70s. The Shah is back in power, but he knows his people didn't put him there. If he holds a free election, he's gone. So he has to rule through a completely different mechanism. He builds a system resting on three pillars: absolute terror, unprecedented wealth, and unwavering U.S. support.
Let's break those pillars down, starting with the security state. The Shah knew he was vulnerable, so he basically imposed a military dictatorship. With extensive training and technical assistance from the CIA, the FBI, and Israel's Mossad, he hurriedly set up a secret police force known as Savak.
And when you read accounts from journalists who were there, like Francis Fitzgerald, they describe this terrifying atmosphere. Savak wasn't just a police force, it was a psychological weapon. They had informants in every hotel lobby, every university classroom, every factory floor. People just disappeared in the middle of the night, and their disappearances went completely unrecorded.
It created an environment of total suffocating paranoia. Families wouldn't even discuss politics at the dinner table because they didn't know if their own children had been recruited as informants. You could not trust anyone. And it effectively dismantled all secular, organized political opposition.
The second pillar was his top-down authoritarian push for modernization, which he called the White Revolution, launched in the early 1960s. He specifically called it white to contrast it with a communist red revolution.
Yeah.
He wanted to preempt a peasant uprising by reforming the country himself. It involved massive land reforms, the creation of a rural literacy corps, and granting female suffrage.
Now, on paper, to a Western observer sitting in Washington or London, those sound like incredibly progressive, noble reforms.
Sure.
But we have to look at how they were implemented and who they hurt. The land reforms were designed to break the power of the traditional feudal landlords. But in doing so, they deeply alienated the traditional bases of Iranian society.
Can you break that down for the listener? Why would giving land to peasants anger the traditional merchants and the religious establishment?
It's a really complex economic ecosystem. The traditional merchant class, the Bazaris, were closely tied to the landowning class. Furthermore, the Bazaris were the primary financial backers of the mosques and the Shia clerical establishment. They paid religious taxes, khums, and zakat, which the clerics used to fund seminaries, orphanages, and large social welfare networks.
Ah, I see. So by destroying the traditional landowning system, the Shah accidentally attacked the financial lifeblood of the religious establishment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Furthermore, the Shah forcibly appropriated lands that were held in religious endowments known as waqf. Combine that massive economic hit with the secular nature of his reforms, like giving women the right to vote and replacing Islamic law with secular courts, and he absolutely infuriated the Shia clerical establishment.
Which raises an incredible contradiction here. The Shah wanted to be this absolute centralized dictator in the tradition of ancient Persian kings. He wanted total control. But he also desperately wanted a pro-capitalist, Western-style modernization.
And you inherently cannot have both. A modern, complex, liberalized economy requires decentralization. It requires a massive middle class that has the freedom to innovate, to communicate, to challenge the status quo.
Right.
The Shah wanted the shiny toys of the West, the factories, the weapons, the high-rises, without allowing any of the political freedoms that make those modern societies actually function.
Which brings us to the shiny toys and the third pillar, the oil wealth. After the Shah helped form OPEC, and especially after the massive price spikes following the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, Iran's oil revenue exploded in a way that almost defies comprehension. It shot up from $1.36 billion in 1970 to over $20 billion in 1974.
It was an astronomical windfall. The Shah genuinely envisioned using this wealth to turn Iran into the world's fifth largest military and economic power within a decade. He called it his great civilization, and he went on an absolute unprecedented spending spree.
But the reality on the ground was a nightmare of bottlenecks. Imagine you are an Iranian farmer in 1974. You've migrated to the slums of Tehran because the land reforms failed to provide you with enough acreage to survive. You can't feed your family, you can't read because 70% of the country is still illiterate. You don't have running water.
Yeah.
But you look up into the sky and you see squadrons of the world's most advanced F-14 fighter jets flying overhead, bought with money dug out of your own soil. That doesn't just make you poor, it makes you furious.
It was hyper-modernization without foundational capacity. The Shah ordered hundreds of millions of dollars in imported goods, food, and machinery. But the country's physical infrastructure simply couldn't handle it. The ports were so congested that ships waited for weeks to be unloaded. Food literally rotted in the hulls of ships while people went hungry.
And the education system couldn't absorb the students. Youth unemployment hovered around 30%. The massive influx of petrodollars triggered massive inflation, which devastated the purchasing power of the middle class and the poor. Meanwhile, a tiny elite connected to the royal court grew incomprehensibly wealthy, flaunting their Western lifestyles.
And through all of this domestic rotting, the United States was essentially writing the Shah blank checks. Under the Nixon doctrine, the U.S. was bogged down in Vietnam and wanted strong regional allies to act as policemen. They chose Iran to be their proxy in the Persian Gulf, a bulwark against the Soviets.
President Richard Nixon visited Tehran in 1972 and basically told the Shah he could buy any conventional weapon in the U.S. arsenal. Iran became the largest recipient of American military hardware in the entire world.
But Washington was completely willfully blind to the domestic reality. They relied entirely on SAVAK for intelligence regarding internal Iranian politics, and SAVAK simply told the Shah and the CIA what they wanted to hear, that everything was totally under control.
Which leads right back to that incredible moment we started with, December 1977. President Jimmy Carter raising his glass and calling Iran an island of stability. It's almost comical in its miscalculation. Because by the late 1970s, the Shah's erratic, oppressive policies had managed to do the impossible. He united four completely distinct, often fiercely antagonistic groups against him.
Right, you have the leftists and Marxists, like the remnants of the Tudeh Party, and urban guerrilla groups who viewed the Shah as an imperialist stooge. You have the secular professionals and intellectuals, the lawyers, writers, and civil servants who desperately wanted democracy and human rights. You have the bazaris, the merchant class suffocating under inflation and state interference. And finally, you have the immensely powerful Shia clerical establishment.
But to topple a state apparatus as powerful as the Shah's, a fractured opposition needs a singular, undeniable voice. They need a focal point. And that brings us to the emergence of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini.
Khomeini is one of the most astute, uncompromising theopolitical leaders in modern history. His emergence is the critical leadership variable that turned widespread discontent into a targeted laser beam.
Yeah.
He was a highly trained scholar of Islamic theology, jurisprudence, and even Western philosophy, who had been a relentless critic of the Pahlavi dynasty for his entire adult life.
His backstory is intense. He was born in the town of Khomeini, and his father, a local cleric, was assassinated when Khomeini was just 5 months old. He rose through the clerical ranks in the holy city of Qom. When the Shah launched the White Revolution, Khomeini was one of the loudest critics. But the breaking point really came in 1964 when the Shah's government granted diplomatic immunity to American military personnel stationed in Iran.
Khomeini publicly condemned this as a capitulation. He argued it proved the Shah had sold Iran's independence to the Americans. He famously asked, "If an American cook runs over the Shah of Iran, no one can touch him. But if the Shah runs over an American dog, he will be prosecuted." That deeply visceral nationalist rhetoric got him arrested.
And SAVAK, fearing that executing a senior cleric would cause an uprising, forced him into exile. First to Turkey, then to Najaf in Iraq, which is one of the holiest sites in Shia Islam, and eventually in 1978 to a suburb of Paris.
But exile did not silence him. It actually insulated him from SAVAK and vastly enhanced his mystique. From afar, he became the untouchable symbol of pure resistance.
Let's talk about why Khomeini specifically rose above all the other opposition leaders. Because there were other, more senior Grand Ayatollahs in Iran. You had Ayatollah Shariat Madari, who was widely respected but believed clerics should only advise governments, not run them. You had Ayatollah Taleghani, who was popular with the youth and supported democratic reforms. So why did Khomeini capture the entire nation?
It comes down to his rhetorical brilliance and his absolute unwavering refusal to compromise. He understood his audience perfectly. While leftist leaders were publishing these dense Marxist manifestos full of academic jargon, talking about dialectical materialism and proletariat struggles that flew completely over the heads of ordinary rural Iranians, Khomeini spoke in simple, vivid, deeply emotional language.
He steeped everything in historical Shia symbols. He didn't just say the Shah was a bad king, he equated the Shah's corruption and ties to America as an existential threat to Islam itself.
Exactly. He exuded this mystical charisma. He had a firm, ascetic, fatherly demeanor that appealed massively to the millions of poor rural migrants who had flooded into the city's slums, feeling entirely culturally alienated and economically left behind by the Shah's glittering modernization.
It's fascinating how his aura grew. I mean, some rural Iranians genuinely believed he was the literal return of the hidden Imam al-Mahdi. For listeners unfamiliar, in Twelver Shia belief, the 12th Imam went into occultation, a state of hiding by God's will in the 9th century, and it is believed he will return at the end of times to bring absolute justice to the world. And Khomeini didn't exactly rush to correct them. He is perfectly happy acquiring the title of Imam.
He was a master of political theater. He embodied the combined virtues of Shia piety, Iranian nationalism, and fierce resistance to tyranny. The entire public knew he absolutely opposed the Shah, but most secularists and leftists in the coalition didn't critically assess his specific, detailed intentions for what would come after the Shah.
Which is terrifying, really. They were so desperate to escape a burning building that they didn't look at the architectural blueprints of the place they were running to. They just assumed, once the Shah is gone, this old religious man will go back to the seminaries and coup, and we, the secular politicians, will run the country. But Khomeini did have plans. Highly specific, completely unprecedented blueprints.
He did. This is the ideological variable of the revolution. Khomeini formulated a revolutionary doctrine known as Vilayat-e-Faqih, or the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. He laid this out in a series of lectures to his students in Iraq in 1970, which were later transcribed and published as a book called Islamic Government.
I found this concept mind-bending because it completely overturns centuries of Islamic tradition. Explain how monumental this shift is. Traditional Shia clerics believe that because the hidden imam is absent, all worldly governments are inherently flawed. Therefore, the religious establishment should remain politically quietist. They oversee, they advise, but they wait for the imam to return to actually lead.
Right, that had been the consensus for centuries. To understand how Khomeini changed that, we have to take a brief deep dive into Islamic history. The original Sunni-Shia split occurred in 632 AD, following the death of the Prophet Muhammad. The split originated over the line of succession. Sunni Islam recognized the elected caliphs as the legitimate political leaders. Shia Islam, however, believed leadership was divinely mandated to remain within the Prophet's family line, starting with his son-in-law Ali, the first Imam.
And the defining foundational trauma of Shia Islam happens a few decades later, at the Battle of Karbala in 680 AD.
Yes. Ali's son, the third Imam Hussein, refused to pledge allegiance to the corrupt Umayyad Caliph Yazid. Hussein, with a tiny band of followers and family members, stood against Yazid's massive army at Karbala. They were brutally slaughtered. For Shia Muslims, the martyrdom of Hussein is the ultimate cosmic symbol of righteous resistance against corrupt tyrannical power. It's passionately mourned annually during the month of Muharram, culminating in the day of Ashura.
So Khomeini brilliantly takes this ancient, deeply emotional theology and weaponizes it for the 20th century. He explicitly equates the Shah Iran with the tyrant Yazid. He makes resisting the Shah not just a political choice about economics or democracy, he makes it a religious duty to avert the tragedy of Karbala from happening again.
But he goes further. To justify Velayat-e-Faqih, Khomeini relies on the four sources of Shia jurisprudence: the Quran, the Sunnah, which are the traditions of the Prophet and the Imam's hijma, or consensus, and most significantly, aql.
Aql, meaning intellect or reasoning.
Exactly. While many Sunni schools historically restricted creative theological interpretation, Shia jurists heavily utilized aql. Khomeini used profound, complex theological reasoning to argue a completely new premise. He said Islam is a complete, comprehensive system designed to govern all aspects of human life. Therefore, a legitimate government must enforce Islamic law, Sharia.
And here's the leap. If the government must enforce Islamic law perfectly, then the only person qualified to lead that government is the supreme expert in that law, the faqih, the jurist.
He argued that a highly qualified Islamic jurist possesses the exact same divine authority as the Prophet Muhammad in the administration of society, and that this authority supersedes even kings, parliaments, and constitutions. He fundamentally invented the concept of the supreme leader.
Let me use an analogy for Western listeners to grasp the sheer audacity of this shift. Imagine if, After centuries of just overseeing the spiritual health of the Catholic Church, a pope suddenly wrote a manifesto declaring that because God's law is supreme, the pope is no longer just the spiritual head of the church, but the literal, absolute executive emperor of the entire world, holding veto power over every president and prime minister until Jesus Christ returns.
That is a phenomenal analogy. It was a staggering theological coup. But Khomeini was also incredibly savvy. He merged this profound theology with language that sounded incredibly modern and populist. He constantly divided the world into the Mostak the arrogant oppressors, or the haves, and the Mustazafin, the downtrodden, the disinherited, or the have-nots.
And here's where it gets really interesting. That terminology sounds straight out of Karl Marx. It sounds exactly like the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Leftist students and communist sympathizers heard those words and thought, yes, Khomeini is a comrade. He's talking about class struggle.
But the text clarifies it was strictly theological, rooted in classical Islamic jurisprudence regarding the domains of faith and arrogance. It was a stroke of absolute genius. He co-opted the revolutionary fervor of the leftists, absorbing their massive numbers into his coalition, while remaining strictly grounded in Islamic theology.
But an ideology, no matter how potent, is just words in a book until it has a distribution network. You need a way to actually get the message to the masses.
And that takes us to the ground game, the organizational variable. The Shah's Savak was incredibly brutal and efficient at hunting down secular political parties, silencing journalists, and dismantling Marxist guerrilla cells. But they had a massive, fatal blind spot. They completely missed the most powerful network of all because it was hiding in plain sight.
The mosque?
Yes. The organizational bedrock of the revolution was the Ruhaniyat, the clerical stratum, centered in the holy city of Qom. The Shah rested part of his legitimacy on his claim to be a devout Shia king, a protector of the faith. Therefore, no matter how paranoid he got, he couldn't just send bulldozers to crush the mosques, and he couldn't completely shut down the seminaries without triggering an immediate holy war.
So while every political rally was banned and every newspaper was censored, the weekly Friday prayers were untouchable. You had thousands of mosques across the country serving as perfectly legal gathering places where the opposition could physically organize.
The sources detail several overlapping networks that utilize this religious infrastructure. First, the JRM, the Society of Combative Clergy. This is a secret core group established in 1977 to overthrow the Shah and explicitly install Khomeini's Islamic order.
And the JRM was a powerhouse. Its founding members included the men who would completely dominate post-revolution Iran, future Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, future President Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, and Ayatollah Mohammad Beheshti, who was essentially the pragmatic organizational genius running the ground movement while Khomeini was in exile.
You also had the AID, the Islamic Students Associations, which were highly active in the universities. And we absolutely cannot discuss the radicalization of the Iranian youth without deeply looking at Ali Shariati.
Yes, Shariati was fascinating. He wasn't a cleric. He was a Sorbonne-educated Iranian sociologist and intellectual.
Shariati preached what he called Red Shiism. He brilliantly blended Western sociology, anti-colonial theory from thinkers like Frantz Fanon, and Shia theology. He promoted a militant, politically assertive Islam. He argued that traditional quietist clerics had turned Islam into a religion of passive mourning.
The quote from Shariati in our source material actually gave me chills. He told the youth, "Every palace should be turned into Karbala, every month into Muharram, and every day into Ashura." He was basically telling the young generation, stop passively crying over Imam Hussein's martyrdom 1,000 years ago. Stand up and actively fight the modern Yazid, the Shah, right now.
Shariati died suddenly in England in 1977 under very suspicious circumstances. Many Iranians firmly believe Savak assassinated him, but his death turned him into a martyr, and his intellectual legacy just poured gasoline on the student movement, bridging the gap between modern educated youth and traditional religious resistance.
Alongside the intellectuals, the text mentions a much more brutal column, the Hezbollahi cells, these partisans of God.
Yes, these were essentially street-level enforcers, often young, poor men from the slums, mobilized by radical clerics. They acted as the physical muscle of the revolution. They clashed with police, broke up communist rallies, and eventually coalesced into squads to protect the clerical leadership and physically eliminate rivals.
What I keep marveling at is the low-tech, high-impact nature of this entire organization. Think about the contrast. The Shah is sitting in a palace relying on billions of dollars of American technology, surveillance equipment, and F-14 fighter jets. Khomeini is sitting cross-legged on a rug in exile in Najaf and later in Paris. He's recording his fiery sermons onto cheap, standard audio cassette tapes.
The cassette tape revolution. It's one of the most brilliant asymmetric communication strategies in history.
These cassettes are smuggled across the border into Iran by pilgrims. They're taken into the basements of mosques, duplicated by the thousands, and then played over loudspeakers at Friday prayers across the entire country.
It completely bypassed the state's total monopoly on television and radio. And ironically, while the revolutionaries hated Western influence, they relied heavily on foreign media to coordinate. The BBC Persian service played a monumental role here.
Really? How so?
Millions of Iranians tuned their radios to the BBC every night, because it was the only uncensored news source, to hear broadcasts detailing the times, locations, and routes of upcoming protests.
So I have to ask, how does a state security apparatus, no matter how brutal, fight an enemy that uses the very religious infrastructure the state claims to uphold, communicates via smuggled mixtapes, and organizes massive rallies using a British radio broadcast?
They can't. The traditional tools of state suppression are entirely useless against it. Which brings us to the climax, 1978. With the tinder bone dry, the ideological blueprint fully set, and the massive mosque network primed, it only took a single spark to ignite the inferno that would burn the Pahlavi dynasty to the ground.
And the Shah's government provided that spark themselves. On January 7, 1978, the Ministry of Information forced a major national newspaper to publish a smear article titled Black and Red Imperialism. It was a vicious, slanderous attack on Ayatollah Khomeini, accusing him of being a British spy, a traitor, and even accusing him of homosexuality and various misdeeds.
It was a catastrophic, arrogant miscalculation. The regime thought they could discredit Khomeini. Instead, the article profoundly outraged the entire religious establishment. Protests immediately erupted in the holy city of Qum. Seminary students took to the streets demanding an apology. The security forces panicked and opened fire, killing several unarmed demonstrators.
And this triggers a deeply cultural mechanism that guarantees the revolution won't just fizzle out.
Exactly. In Shia Islamic tradition, a major memorial service, the Arbeen, is held 40 days after a person's death. So 40 days after the massacre in Qum, on February 18th, massive protests occurred in multiple cities, including Tabriz, to mourn the victims. The government sent in tanks, and security forces killed more people.
So the clock just resets. 40 days after the Tabriz massacre, in late March, another wave of mourning protests erupts across even more cities, and more people are killed.
It created a relentless, self-sustaining 40-day cyclical rhythm of protest, state violence, and martyrdom. The regime was trapped. If they didn't shoot, the protests grew. If they did shoot, they guaranteed an even larger protest 40 days later.
The cascading rhythm of grief and rage, and then comes the point of absolute no return. September 8, 1978, a day known as Black Friday.
Despite the Shah declaring martial law and banning all unauthorized gatherings, massive crowds gathered in Tehran's Jealous Square.
Yeah.
The military, tense and exhausted, ordered the crowd to disperse. When they didn't, the army brought in helicopter gunships and opened fire with live ammunition directly into the dense crowd.
The official death toll is heavily disputed, but historians estimate between 300 and 400 civilians were slaughtered that day.
Black Friday shattered any remaining illusion that the Shah was a benevolent, paternal monarch. The psychological bond between the king and his subjects was permanently broken. The public anger shifted from demanding reforms to demanding the absolute destruction of the monarchy. And crucially, it triggered a massive shift in the labor force.
Yes, late October 1978, the working class finally joins the students and the clerics. The oil industry workers go on strike.
That is the kill shot. Iran's entire economy, the Shah's entire modern military apparatus, ran entirely on oil revenue. When the workers in the southern oil fields turned off the tap, the economy went into immediate freefall. The massive wealth that the Shah relied on to buy loyalty vanished overnight. Elite loyalists panicked, packed their suitcases with cash, and began fleeing the country.
The Shah tries everything to survive. He appoints a military government under General Azari, trying to crush the strikes by force. But it fails. The troops are exhausted. Junior officers and young conscripts, horrified by shooting their own countrymen, start deserting and joining the protests.
By December 1978, during the sacred month of Muharram, which is the month mourning the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, the mobilization reached a scale rarely seen in human history.
Up to 17 million people. Think about that number. That was roughly half the adult population of the entire country marching peacefully in Tehran and other cities, carrying banners, demanding the Shah's immediate removal and Khomeini's return.
It was a total societal rejection. The Shah was isolated, deeply depressed, and secretly dying of cancer, a fact he had hidden from almost everyone, including his American allies. In a desperate final move, he appoints a longtime secular opposition figure, Shapur Bakhtiar, as prime minister, hoping to appease the liberal wing of the protests.
But nobody buys it. Bakhtiar's own opposition party immediately expels him for accepting a job from the hated king. The Shah's grip is entirely gone.
And this is where the geopolitical chess game reaches its climax. The Carter administration in Washington is completely disoriented. For years, they had been entirely reliant on Savak's overly optimistic intelligence. They fundamentally misunderstood the power of religion in the Middle East, viewing everything solely through a Cold War, U.S. versus Soviet lens.
The text mentions a critical turning point on November 9, 1978. The U.S. ambassador to Iran, William Sullivan, sends a blunt cable back to Washington titled, "Thinking the Unthinkable." He finally tells the State Department, "The Shah's doomed. He cannot survive this. We need to plan for his exit and start talking to Khomeini."
And Washington scrambles in absolute panic. On January 3, 1979, President Carter makes a fateful decision. He sends the deputy commander of U.S. forces in Europe, Air Force General Robert Heiser, to Tehran. But he's not sent to help the Shah crush the rebellion.
Wait, this blew my mind when I read it. What is Heiser's actual mission?
He is sent to meet with the top Iranian generals and explicitly tell them not to stage a military coup to save the monarchy.
The United States is actively telling the Iranian military, a force they spent billions building, to stand down. Why?
Because Washington realized the Shah was a lost cause. Their primary fear wasn't an Islamic Republic. Their primary fear was a massive, bloody civil war that would completely destabilize the region and give the Soviet Union the perfect excuse to cross the border and intervene. They naively hoped that by holding the military back, there could be a smooth, peaceful transition of power where the military might form a moderate coalition with Khomeini's secular allies.
Did the U.S. essentially get played by Khomeini's camp here? Because while he's sitting in a tent outside Paris, Khomeini is running an incredibly sophisticated diplomatic game.
They were entirely outmaneuvered. The source details how Khomeini, advised by pragmatic, Western-educated aides like the Iranian-American physician Ibrahim Yazdi, engaged in extensive back-channel communications with the Carter administration.
Right. Yazdi essentially acts as the translator, and he assures Washington that a Khomeini-led Islamic government would be democratic, that it would respect human rights, and most importantly, that it would not threaten U.S. strategic oil interests.
Yes. Yazdi assured them that because Islam is inherently opposed to godless communism, an Islamic Republic would remain a fierce, impenetrable buffer against the Soviet Union.
So Khomeini's camp is basically whispering to Washington, don't worry, we still hate the Soviets just as much as you do. The Shah is finished, let him fall, and we can do business. And the U.S. buys it. They drop their absolute support for the Shah.
They drop him completely. On January 17, 1979, a humiliated, terminally ill Mohammad Reza Shah boards an airplane weeping and flees Iran for what was officially called a temporary vacation abroad. He would never return, eventually dying in exile in Cairo. And to add to the humiliation, the U.S. initially refused to even give him asylum for fear of angering Khomeini and endangering the American embassy in Tehran.
2 weeks later, on February 1st, 1979, an Air France Boeing 747 lands in Tehran. Ayatollah Khomeini steps off the plane after 15 years in exile, returning to a tumultuous, ecstatic welcome from an estimated 5 million people filling the streets.
And the moment he is back on Iranian soil and the military formally declares neutrality, Khomeini completely flips the script on the United States and his secular allies.
So all those back-channel assurances meant absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all. Once Khomeini realized the U.S. had abandoned the Shah and the military was paralyzed, he saw zero reason to compromise. He moved ruthlessly to consolidate power. He established his theocratic velayat-e-faqih, appointing himself supreme leader with absolute authority. He purged the secularists, the liberals, and the Marxists who had fought alongside him, and he utterly severed all ties with the United States, branding them the Great Satan, permanently altering the geopolitical balance of the Middle East.
It is an incredible synthesis of history. The comparison the expert text makes to Lenin earlier is just so apt. Lenin used German trains and funding to get back to Russia, allied with other socialists to overthrow the Tsar, and then fought a chaotic transitional government to install an absolute secular dictatorship.
And Khomeini waited out a 15-year exile, harnessed a massive, decentralized grassroots religious movement, neutralized the greatest superpower on earth with back-channel diplomatic promises, and installed an indigenous, uncompromising theocracy that shocked the entire globe.
To summarize what we've unpacked today, The Iranian Revolution was the absolute perfect storm. You had a deeply flawed, foreign-backed modernization project that violently alienated its own people, combining deep poverty with extreme cultural disorientation. This tinderbox met a brilliant, religiously resonant, uncompromising leader in Khomeini who utilized an untouchable, centuries-old mosque network to distribute a radically adapted, highly specific theology.
It is the ultimate blueprint of how history is actually made, not by sudden, unpredictable explosions, but by decades of intense compounding pressure, finally finding a microscopic crack in the foundation. And to you listening to this today, it is crucial to understand that this isn't just dry academic history.
It's the key to the modern world.
Absolutely. Grasping the dynamics, the resentments, and the theological mechanisms of the 1979 revolution is the absolute prerequisite for understanding today's global landscape. Everything from the balance of power in the Persian Gulf, the ongoing proxy wars, the intense friction between the U.S. and Iran, the ideological battles across the Middle East, it all radiates outward from the events of those few months. You cannot understand the news today without understanding 1979.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought that I want to leave you with to mull over. Our source text notes early on that revolutions, by their very nature, typically devour their makers. The broad coalition is destroyed by the single dominant faction, and for a revolutionary ideology to survive long-term, it often has to adapt to reality. We see this with China having to embrace a form of state-guided capitalism just to maintain the Communist Party's grip on power.
Right. Ideology eventually collides with the practical demands of governing a modern state.
Exactly. The Iranian Revolution succeeded by replacing a secular, foreign-backed dictator with a divine, absolute Islamic jurist. But here is the profound question. If the structural pressures of society, the economy, the desires of the youth, the need for international integration demand fundamental reform in the future, how does the next generation of citizens push for that change? Because in a traditional dictatorship, you are just arguing with a corrupt man. But in the system established in 1979, disagreeing with the structure of the government has been legally, fundamentally, and theologically framed as disagreeing with God himself.
That is the profound, perhaps unsolvable dilemma of a theocracy born from revolution. How do you reform the divine?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you. Keep looking for the historical rot beneath the political foundation, and we will see you next time. You know, usually when we talk about revolutions, there's an expectation of a certain predictable formula.
Right, like a mathematical equation almost.
Exactly. It's almost like physics. You look at a society, you see a starving peasantry, a collapsing economy, widespread famine, and the math just inevitably adds up to a mass uprising.
Yeah, the equation is clean. You know exactly why people are out in the streets.
Right. It's the classic cause and effect we're taught to look for.
Absolutely. A society hits absolute rock bottom, survival becomes, impossible under the current regime, and the people push back simply because they have nothing left to lose.
But then you step into the historical landscape of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and suddenly that whole mathematical equation is just completely broken.
It really is. I mean, we're looking at a revolutionary event that Western observers at the time literally called deviant.
Deviant, yeah, it was considered totally unthinkable. We aren't talking about a revolt that happened during a depression.
Yeah.
We are looking at a revolution that erupted right in the middle of a massive, unprecedented economic boom.
Which is wild. And beyond the economic anomaly, you have this incredible sociological puzzle. You have the most fiercely opposed groups you could possibly imagine.
Oh, yeah. Marxist-Leninist guerrillas, right?
Exactly. Marxists, conservative religious clerics, secular university students, and traditional bazaar merchants. All of them standing shoulder to shoulder, united against a single monarch.
Which, according to standard social science models of the era, that simply should not have been possible.
No, it defies all the conventional logic.
Which is exactly what we are going to untangle today. We're taking a deep dive into how an event this expectation-defying actually came together.
And we got some fantastic source material to guide us through it today.
We do. And to do that, we are looking strictly at the historical mechanics and the cultural shifts exactly as they're laid out in our source material, specifically Revolution and Islamic Republic.
Right, and just to be clear, we are looking at the facts here.
Yes. No taking sides, no ideological endorsements, just an impartial breakdown of the facts provided in the text. So I want you to imagine you are the Shah of Iran in the 1970s for a second.
Okay, you're picturing it.
You look out your window, oil revenues are just flooding in, the standard of living is rapidly rising, and your advisors are telling you that you are universally beloved. You'd probably believe them, wouldn't you?
Um, Human nature being what it is, yeah, you probably would.
So, okay, let's unpack this. How does a ruler in that exact position end up facing a revolt by virtually his entire society?
Well, to understand that, you have to look at the psychological environment the state had built around itself over the previous couple of decades.
The echo chamber, basically.
Exactly. The Shah was essentially a victim of his own propaganda. The state had engaged in this very deliberate strategy of what we can call the politics of elimination.
Starting right after the 1953 coup, right?
Yes. From that point on, they systematically dismantled any form of political opposition.
Let's actually define who we mean by opposition here, because it wasn't just one group, was it?
Oh, far from it. I mean, they started with the obvious threats to the monarchy, sure. They eliminated the Tudeh Party, which was essentially the Soviet-backed communist organization.
Right, makes sense from their perspective.
Yeah, and then they moved on to the National Front, who were your standard secular nationalists. But the dragnet didn't stop at the ideological extremes.
That's where it gets dangerous.
Right. The state eventually moved against independent-minded loyalists, people within the conservative establishment who actually supported the regime, but, occasionally offered independent advice or gentle criticism.
Wow. So they couldn't even tolerate polite disagreement from their own side.
Exactly. And by the 1960s, this elimination strategy reached moderate open organizations. A prime example is Mehdi Bazargan's freedom movement.
And these were the Muslim Democrats, right?
Yes, they were.
Mm.
They did not want a radical Islamic state. They were pushing for parliamentary democracy. They genuinely believed modernity and Islam were completely compatible.
So they were reformers, not revolutionaries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And their reward for pursuing peaceful democratic reform was being hauled into military courts and thrown in jail.
So wait, if you are an autocratic leader, you might think, great, I've cleared the board, no more critics. But let's look at the mechanics of what actually happens to a society when you do that.
It doesn't usually work out the way they plan.
No, it doesn't. Think of it like a car's suspension system. If you systematically remove the shocks and struts, which in a society are your moderates, your peaceful critics, your democratic reformers, you don't make the car invincible.
Right.
You just guarantee that the very first time you hit a major pothole, there is absolutely nothing to absorb the impact, and the entire chassis shatters.
What's fascinating here is that that's a perfect way to visualize it. Removing the peaceful opposition didn't secure the state's absolute power at all. It actively cultivated radicalized violent opposition.
It's that pressure cooker effect.
Yes, it is a profound dialectical effect. You have a generation of young, fiery university students who looked at those peaceful, democratic leaders sitting in jail cells and drew a very logical conclusion.
That peaceful protest is a dead end.
Exactly. They decided that unarmed, legal struggle is completely bankrupt. You cannot fight tanks and secret police with parliamentary debate.
So by crushing the moderates, the Shah practically handed the keys over to armed guerrilla movements.
He really did.
And this is where you get the rise of groups like the Marxist-Leninist Fadhis and the Islamic Mujahideen factions that believed violence was the only language the state understood.
Yes. So the physical moderate opposition was wiped out, replaced by armed radicals. But at the exact same time, the state was losing a completely different kind of war.
The cultural war.
Right, the psychological and cultural battle for the minds of the intellectuals.
I need to pause here because this is the part of the history that always trips me up.
It is a bit counterintuitive.
It really is. For decades, Iranian intellectuals had been demanding modernization. They blamed the traditional state for the country's backwardness.
Right, they wanted European-style development, modern factories, secular institutions.
Yeah, they used to mock the government by pointing out that the country had to import its own sewing needles because it lacked a basic steel industry.
They viewed westernization as the absolute ultimate goal.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The Shah uses the massive oil wealth to do exactly what they asked for. He builds modern industries, he encourages Western culture, and breaks ties with traditional forces.
He delivers on the modernization.
And the second he does this, the intellectuals completely move the goalposts. Suddenly, all this modernization they've been begging for is declared a toxic disease. How does that psychological flip even happen?
Well, it really comes down to a desperate search for authenticity. When the state became the ultimate champion of rapid top-down modernization, the intellectuals felt culturally alienated.
Because they hated the autocrat.
Exactly. They couldn't be on the same side as the autocrat they despised. So they traded places. They began to condemn this exact development as dependency on Western imperialism.
Which brings us to a massively influential concept spreading through the cafes and universities at the time. Garbzadegi.
Yes.
Yeah.
Usually translated as Weststruckness or Westdoxication. It was popularized in 1962 by Jalal al-Ahmad.
And he was an interesting figure, wasn't he?
Very. He was a secular leftist intellectual, but he came from a clerical family and had deep roots in European philosophy.
So he had feet in both worlds.
He did. And he famously likened this uncritical, wholesale adoption of Western culture to a physical disease, literally comparing it to a plague like cholera.
Wow. A plague. That's strong language.
It was. And his genius was that he managed to articulate a frustration that appealed to both the secular leftists who hated American imperialism and the religious traditionalists who hated secularization. He bridged a massive cultural gap.
And he wasn't the only one reshaping the ideological landscape. You also have Ali Shariati.
No, yeah, Shariati.
Now, Shariati is fascinating. He's a sociologist who studied in Paris, highly charismatic. And he looks at the youth, who are deeply enamored with Che Guevara, Marxist ideas of revolution, class struggle.
The standard global leftist movements of the 60s and 70s.
Right. And Shariati essentially says to them, we don't need to import European Marxism to have a revolution. We already have the ultimate revolutionary ideology right here in our own history, in Shia Islam.
Shariati did something incredibly potent there. He blended Marxist sociological concepts with traditional religion.
He kind of redefined the religious history, right?
He did. He drew a sharp distinction between what he called Safavid Shi'ism and Alid Shi'ism.
Okay, break that down for us.
So Safavid Shi'ism he viewed as the reactionary institutionalized religion of the conservative clerics, the establishment.
The status quo.
Right. But Alid Shi'ism, he argued, was the true original faith, a radical, action-oriented ideology of social justice and revolution. He effectively created a revolutionary Islam with a modern, militant face.
So he's basically taking the language of global leftist revolution and translating it into a native Islamic context that resonates with the Iranian youth.
Precisely. It was brilliant from a mobilization standpoint.
And while Shariati is doing that, you have Ayatollah Khomeini, exiled in Najaf, Iraq, doing something equally revolutionary within the traditional religious framework.
Yes, because traditional Shia doctrine had largely been quietist for centuries. The belief was that true, legitimate government belongs only to the hidden imam, the Mahdi.
So the clerics were supposed to stay out of politics.
Basically, yes. Until his return, the clerics should generally stay out of direct political rule and just advise the monarchs. But Khomeini formulates a radical new theory called Vilayat-e-Faqih, or the guardianship of the jurisconsult.
He argues that in the absence of the hidden imam, the clerics shouldn't just sit back and advise. They must actually rule directly to ensure Islamic law is upheld.
Exactly. He completely rejects the entire concept of monarchy, calling it fundamentally incompatible with Islam.
So if you put all these pieces together, you see the society that the Shah is ruling over. The moderate middle has been jailed.
Right.
The youth are armed with Shariati's revolutionary sociology. The religious masses are being energized by Khomeini's uncompromising demand for a theocracy.
And the secular intellectuals have decided that the state's entire modernization project is a Western disease.
Right. And the public's alienation is so total that they refuse to give the Shah credit for literally anything, even things that would normally cause massive patriotic celebration.
Oh, the cynicism was absolute.
Yeah, when the state secured the 1973 oil boom, or when the military occupied the Tomb Islands in the Persian Gulf, the public universally dismissed it. They just said, oh, the Shah is just following orders from his American and British masters.
The level of societal mockery was intense. I mean, they fought the regime's grandeur with rumors and jokes.
Like the coronation rumor?
Yes. When the Shah had his magnificent coronation in 1967, the public spread a widespread rumor that the Queen Mother had actually died, and the woman sitting on television was a mechanical doll.
That is just surreal.
It is. And when the state proudly announced the occupation of the Tomb Islands, the public mocked the Shah by calling him the conqueror of underpants, simply because the plural of tum in Persian sounded like the word for underpants.
It is wild. It shows a complete breakdown of trust. The state was viewed as inherently incapable of doing anything genuine.
They had completely lost the narrative.
So you have a society culturally alienated, armed with powerful new ideologies, devoid of any legal political outlet, and lacking any shock
A
absorbers.
literal powder keg.
Exactly. All this environment needed was a spark. And oddly enough, the catalyst starts with an American presidential election.
Right. Jimmy Carter's election in 1976.
How does that play into this?
Well, Carter campaigned heavily on a platform of global human rights. The Shah, remembering past tensions with Democratic administrations like Kennedy's, decided to proactively relax censorship, pardon some political prisoners, and allow international inspections of his jails.
But remember, because the Shah had ruled with an iron fist for so long, the opposition didn't see this as a genuine change of heart.
No, they interpreted it as weakness.
Exactly. They assumed Carter was ordering the Shah to back down. This led to a bold new wave of open dissent. You get events like the famous 1977 Poetry Nights, where thousands of people gathered over 10 nights in Tehran, ostensibly to listen to poetry, but really to demand basic rights and freedom of expression.
It was a tense reform movement at that point, but the actual match that ignited the massive street protests was struck in January 1978.
And ironically, it was struck by the state itself.
It really was an unforced error.
This is the part that completely baffles me. Let's look at the mechanics of this decision. The government publishes a pseudonymously written article in the Etalat newspaper, a major daily, and it is a blatant smear piece against Ayatollah Khomeini.
A vicious one, too.
They call him an Indian side, accuse him of being a British and Soviet agent, and mock him as a reactionary adventurer. Tensions are already at a boiling point. Why on earth would the state intentionally throw a match into that environment?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it was a catastrophic miscalculation born of pure hubris. The state, isolated in its echo chamber, genuinely thought they could easily discredit a cleric in exile.
They just didn't get it.
They fundamentally misunderstood how much Khomeini had come to symbolize resistance. Instead of turning the public against him, the reaction in the religious city of Qum was immediate and explosive.
The religious colleges and the bazaars shut down, right?
Yes. There were massive riots, clashes with security forces, and civilian deaths.
And those deaths trigger a mechanism deeply embedded in the culture. The traditional Shia 40-day cycle of mourning.
This is absolutely crucial for understanding the momentum of the revolution.
Walk us through how that worked.
Well, in Shia tradition, you mourn the dead, and then you hold a major memorial service on the 40th day. So, 40 days after the protesters were killed in Qom, massive crowds gathered in the city of Tabriz to mourn them.
And then what happened?
That protest turned violent, the army fired on the crowd, and more people died.
Which mathematically starts a brand new 40-day countdown.
Precisely. 40 days later, there are memorial protests in multiple cities, including Isfahan and Shiraz. More clashes, more deaths. It became a self-sustaining rhythmic engine of mass mobilization.
Wow. A compounding interest of grief.
That's a great way to put it. These mourning cycles radicalized the entire environment. Every 40 days, the temperature went up, which completely undermined any remaining moderate reformists who wanted to negotiate.
It crowned Khomeini as the undisputed leader. He was in exile, completely uncompromising, demanding the total downfall of the Shah, and the streets were bleeding on a 40-day rhythm for him.
And then the violence escalated even further.
Right. In August 1978, the situation reaches a horrifying peak with the Cinema Rex fire in Abadan. Over 400 people burned to death inside a locked movie theater.
It was an unimaginable tragedy. And the crime was never fully investigated at the time, but the public immediately and unanimously blamed Savak, the Shah's secret police.
Wait, why would they blame the secret police for a theater fire?
Well, the state had previously been claiming that the religious opposition were backward reactionaries who hated modern things like cinemas. So the public believed the state burned the theater to frame the opposition.
I see.
It almost didn't matter what the forensic truth was. The trust in the government was at absolute zero. The state was blamed by default for every tragedy.
This spirals directly into September 1978 and a day that became known as Black Friday.
Yes, a turning point.
Martial law had been declared in Tehran, but huge crowds still gathered in Zala Square. The army was ordered to disperse them, and when the crowd refused to leave, the troops opened fire with live ammunition.
The casualties were very heavy.
It essentially severed any remaining hope that a peaceful compromise could be reached.
And while the political and religious tensions are exploding, we have to look at the underlying economic reality, because it provides the mass momentum. We mentioned the oil boom earlier.
Yeah, you would think quadrupling national oil revenues would make everyone happy.
You would think so. But let's look at how that actually functioned. The government pumped so much money into the economy so fast that supply chains just couldn't handle it. It triggered massive demand-push inflation.
Right. Let's unpack how that feels on the ground. It wasn't just numbers on a ledger. This caused a severe housing crisis. Prices and rents skyrocketed.
It was devastating for the middle class.
Yeah, if you were a young, educated, middle-class family, you suddenly found yourself completely priced out of your own city.
And for the poor rural migrants pouring into the cities looking for work, it was even worse. They couldn't afford housing at all, so they built shanty towns outside the official city limits areas called out-of-bounds estates.
And how did the government handle that?
Because they were technically illegal settlements, the government sent demolition crews to bulldoze these homes. They literally turned poor neighborhoods into battlegrounds between riot police and impoverished families.
Unbelievable. And how does the government respond to the inflation? They decide to blame the merchants. They launch this aggressive anti-profiteering campaign.
Yes, sending thousands of young inspectors into the traditional bazaars to find merchants, close shops, and cancel licenses.
Which is a huge mistake. Now, the bazaar isn't just a shopping mall. It is the traditional socioeconomic spine of the country. It funds the clerics. It holds the community together.
Exactly.
By attacking it, the state managed to alienate the poorest working-class migrants and the wealthy traditional bazaar merchants at the exact same time.
So by November 1978, you have strikes paralyzing the entire country. The oil workers, the banks, the postal service, even the judges are refusing to work.
The whole system just grinds to a halt.
Right. And the Shah finally realizes the gravity of the situation. He goes on national television and delivers a speech that is completely uncharacteristic for an absolute monarch.
The famous "I heard the message" speech.
Yes. He looks at the camera and says, "I too heard the message of your revolution." He promises an end to corruption. He promises free elections. He practically begs the religious leaders for help.
But the public, fueled by decades of deep distrust and the blood recently spilled on Black Friday, just sees it as a desperate, deceptive ploy to buy time.
They don't believe a word of it.
No. The slogan in the streets was, "Let him go and let there be a flood afterwards."
The Shah then tries a last resort. He appoints a military government under General Azari to forcefully restore order, and Azari makes a truly bizarre public claim.
Oh, this part is just fascinating.
The citizens of Tehran had taken to going on their rooftops every single night, shouting, "Allah Akbar, God is greatest," into the darkness. It was a massive, decentralized psychological protest, millions of voices echoing across the city.
So what does Azari say?
Azari goes on television and claims that the rooftop chants are entirely faked by the opposition, that it's just people playing cassette tapes on loudspeakers to make it sound like a crowd.
The public's response to this is brilliant. The very next day, millions of people are marching in the streets, openly mocking the military government with a rhyming slogan.
I love this detail.
They chanted, "Miserable Azari four-star donkey, keep saying it's tapes, but tapes have no legs."
It perfectly captures how the state had entirely lost control of the narrative. Ironically, though, cassettes actually were the engine of the revolution.
Wait, really? How so?
Cassette tapes and photocopiers allowed Khomeini's sermons, smuggled in from Paris, to bypass state censorship entirely and be duplicated infinitely across the country.
So it was effectively the social media of 1979.
Exactly. The analog internet.
Which brings us to the spectacular final collapse in February 1979. So what does this all mean? The Shah has already fled the country. Khomeini has returned to a massive welcome. But the Shah's elite, fiercely loyal military unit, the Imperial Guards, are still holding out in their bases.
Right. On February 5th, personnel from the Air Force are sitting in their barracks, watching a television broadcast of Khomeini's return.
And the Imperial Guards decide to attack the Air Force barracks to punish them for their apparent disloyalty.
Yes.
Think about the tragic irony here. The Shah poured vast amounts of the nation's oil wealth into building this hyper-modern, heavily armed military apparatus specifically to protect his regime.
And in the final hours of the monarchy, his own Air Force is fighting his own elite Imperial Guards.
And the moment the Air Force appeals to the public for help, thousands of armed civilian guerrillas, those Marxist and Islamic groups we talked about earlier, rush to the base and attack the Imperial Guards from the rear.
The military high command, terrified of an all-out civil war within its own ranks, officially declares neutrality and orders all troops back to their barracks.
The final remnants of the state simply evaporate.
The Shah falls. And because he ruled completely alone for decades without ever allowing a political establishment, a loyal opposition, or any independent civil institutions to exist, he fell alone.
Even his last-ditch, desperate prime minister, Shapur Bakhtiar, was immediately expelled by his own political party and completely rejected by the public.
Once the military stepped aside, there was just a hollow shell.
It is an unbelievable sequence of events that highlights the danger of autocratic isolation.
Truly.
To distill what we've unpacked in this deep dive, the 1979 Iranian Revolution defied every historical expectation. It wasn't born out of economic depression, but from profound cultural alienation amidst immense mismanaged wealth.
Right. It was a result of a silenced moderate middle, a deeply out-of-touch leadership, and a highly potent, unprecedented mix of Marxist sociology and radicalized Islamic ideology.
A combination that somehow managed to unite an incredibly fractured society against a single, isolated ruler.
It leaves us with a fascinating and, frankly, daunting reality about the nature of revolutions. You look at this incredibly diverse coalition, Marxist guerrillas who want a socialist utopia, Muslim Democrats seeking a parliamentary system, traditional conservative clerics demanding a theocracy, and modern secular students protesting imperialism.
They were united by absolutely nothing except their shared, burning desire to overthrow a dictator.
Which leads to the ultimate provocative thought, something you can definitely spend some time pondering on your own after we wrap up today.
Yeah, think about this. When a revolution is forged by an alliance of people who fundamentally disagree on how the world should work, what happens the morning after they win?
Because taking down the old system is often the easiest part. Building the new one is where the real fractures appear. How does a society transition from knowing exactly what it is against to agreeing on what it's actually for?
That is a question that continues to echo through history. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the historical dynamics of 1979. We hope this exploration encourages you to keep questioning the narratives of history.
Because sometimes when you look closely at the math of a revolution, you find out the equation is far more complex than it appears on the surface.
Welcome back to another deep dive. Today we're looking at a history that, well, it honestly feels like a thriller.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly dramatic.
Yeah, and to set this up for you listening, I want you to think of a massive industrial boiler, one that's been operating under immense pressure for decades.
Right.
And to keep it from exploding, the operators have systematically welded, every single pressure release valve completely shut.
Which is obviously a terrible idea.
Right. So the exterior casing looks solid, it looks impenetrable and completely stable, but inside the pressure is quietly, violently reaching critical mass.
Yeah, and when a system design like that finally fails, it doesn't just spring a leak.
No, the entire casing just shatters all at once.
And the sheer suddenness of the shattering is what makes the Iranian Revolution of 1979 such a vital historical case study.
It really is.
We are looking at a seemingly invincible, heavily armed monarchy that didn't experience like a slow, visible decline.
Right. It just vanished.
Yeah, it effectively evaporated in under 7 months, just completely replaced by a theocratic state.
And because this history is, so highly charged, the text we're analyzing today deliberately strips away any modern political endorsements. We want to be really clear with you. We are not taking sides here. We're not endorsing the Pahlavi monarchy or the Islamic Republic.
Exactly. We're just looking at the cold mechanics.
Right. The human decisions and the ideological shifts that caused a modern, entrenched system to literally melt away.
And the baseline context of mid-1970s Iran sets this up perfectly, I think.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because from the outside, the Shah's regime was projecting an image of total, unquestionable control, right?
Oh, absolutely. They had this massive military, sprawling infrastructure projects and the steadfast backing of global superpowers.
But beneath that highly polished surface, the pressure in the boiler was building.
Right, because the country was experiencing a sudden, jarring economic slowdown. Global oil revenues were dropping.
And that economic shock collided with massive demographic shifts, didn't it?
Yeah. Thanks to earlier land reforms, traditional rural populations were flooding into the cities at unprecedented rates.
Wow.
So this created these sprawling, impoverished neighborhoods pushed right up against centers of extreme elite wealth.
So the visual inequality alone was just a constant daily friction.
Exactly.
Okay, so the foundation is clearly under immense structural strain. But the catalyst that turns this quiet tension into an active, burning revolution, it actually starts with a rather cinematic, almost surreal moment in November 1977.
Yeah, this is a crazy detail.
The Shah is visiting U.S. President Jimmy Carter in Washington. They are having this grand, heavily orchestrated, welcoming ceremony on the South Lawn of the White House. But just outside the gates, Massive clashes break out between pro-Shah students and anti-Shah protesters.
And the Washington police deploy tear gas to break up the melee.
Right.
And the wind actually carries the smoke directly over the White House lawn, just engulfing the entire ceremony.
It's wild to picture. You have the Shah of Iran and the President of the United States standing at the podium on international television, both physically weeping from the tear gas.
It's such an ominous visual metaphor for what's to come.
Seriously. But the actual diplomatic context of that visit is the real stimulant, isn't it?
Yeah, because President Carter had just come into office pushing a brand new foreign policy.
Yeah.
One heavily focused on human rights.
Which was a big shift.
A massive shift. For decades prior, the United States had unconditionally backed the Shah's regime. Carter's new rhetoric totally shifted the political wind.
So it wasn't that Jimmy Carter caused the revolution?
No. But Iranian intellectuals and dissidents sensed that the regime might no longer have a blank check for absolute repression.
So they began testing the waters.
Exactly. They started writing open letters demanding constitutional accountability and basic freedoms.
And the Shah's reaction to this newfound defiance was unusually hesitant, which is fascinating, largely because of a massive secret he was keeping from the world, and even from much of his own government.
He had been battling lymphoma for years.
Yeah, and by 1977, the cancer was no longer in remission. The heavy medication and the toll of the illness itself were severely impairing his ability to make crucial, high-stakes decisions.
Right.
It makes me think of, like a heavily micromanaged corporation where the CEO holds every single string.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Like he makes every tiny operational decision and fosters a corporate culture of total subservience. If that CEO suddenly gets sick and goes quiet, the entire executive team completely freezes.
Because they have no idea what to do.
Exactly. The generals and ministers in Iran had zero independent agency because the Shah had intentionally designed the system that way, to protect himself against a coup.
Right. The Iranian military and political elite had been systematically stripped of their initiative for a quarter century.
But didn't the regime realize people were angry? Didn't they try to fix it at all?
Well, they did eventually attempt to react to the growing public anger, but their attempts were fatal misfires. The Shah tried to appease the public by firing his longtime prime minister, Amir Abbas Hoveyda, and he replaced him with Jamshid Amuzigar, an American-educated technocrat.
Okay, so trying to bring in new blood.
Right, and Amuzigar's strategy was to cool the temperature. He released some political prisoners, stopped some of the secret military tribunals, and relaxed press censorship.
Which, logically, that sounds like a rational way to release some pressure. You open a valve.
You didn't think so?
But in the psychology of an autocracy, it backfires disastrously.
Completely.
To a populace that had been aggressively repressed for 25 years, a sudden loosening of the grip doesn't look like genuine reform. It looks like desperation.
Exactly. It signals to the opposition that the regime is deeply vulnerable. It effectively tells them, keep pushing. The state is backing down.
And the defiance started to manifest in ways that completely bypassed the state's security apparatus.
Yeah, like in October 1977.
Right. One of the first major displays of public defiance wasn't a violent riot with barricades. It was a cultural event at the Goethe Institute in Tehran.
They hosted 10 nights of poetry readings.
Poetry!
Yeah. Thousands of people gathered in the autumn rain, just overflowing into the streets, just to hear prominent poets and writers recite these veiled anti-regime verses.
It was this massive collective exhale of discontent. It broke the psychological barrier of fear. It proved to the people that they could gather in huge numbers, feel the exact same anger, and the secret police wouldn't instantly crush them.
But the true point of no return, the match dropped into the powder keg, really happened in January 1978.
Driven by a catastrophic, unforced error by the state.
Yeah. The regime planted a highly insulting smear article in the Atella newspaper.
Attacking Ayatollah Khomeini.
Right, an uncompromising cleric who had been living in exile for 14 years. The article was designed to destroy his reputation on all fronts.
What did it say?
It accused him of being a British colonial agent to attack his nationalist credentials and an opium addict to attack his religious purity.
Wow.
The regime assumed they could discredit him and marginalize his followers. Instead, the article provoked absolute outrage. Seminarians and students in the city of Qom took to the streets in fierce protest.
And the security forces intervened and opened fire, killing several protesters.
Yes.
And this triggers the unique structural mechanics of this specific revolution. The text points out a terrifying mathematical rhythm to the ensuing protests.
What's fascinating here is how deeply tied this was to the 40-day Shia mourning cycle.
Right.
Every time the regime killed protesters, they essentially locked in an even bigger protest exactly 40 days later.
Because in Shia Islamic tradition, families and communities hold a major mourning commemoration on the 40th day after a person's death.
Known as the Arba'in.
Right, the Arba'in. So because the state killed protesters in Qom, a massive memorial gathering was scheduled 40 days later in the city of Tabriz,
And that memorial naturally transformed into a massive anti-government protest.
which led the military to step in again.
Right, and more people were killed in Tabriz.
Which means, exactly 40 days after Tabriz, you have more mourning gatherings, this time spreading to multiple cities simultaneously.
Which lead to more protests.
And inevitably, more killings by the security forces.
It became a self-sustaining engine of mobilization. The secular state simply couldn't disrupt it.
They weren't just fighting a political movement, they were fighting a religious calendar.
Exactly. The opposition utilized these deeply embedded cultural rhythms to create an unstoppable, escalating momentum.
And as the violence escalated, sheer tragedy completely destroyed the unwritten social contract of the autocracy. We have to look at the Rex Cinema fire in Abadan in August 1978.
Just horrific.
Nearly 400 people, including women and children, burned to death because the doors of the theater were locked from the outside.
And the public instantly blamed the Shah's secret police, the Savak.
Even though historical evidence actually heavily points to Islamic extremists setting the fire as part of their campaign against westernized movie theaters.
Right, but the factual truth didn't matter in the slightest at that point.
No.
The regime's credibility was so utterly bankrupt that the public genuinely believed the state was capable of burning its own citizens alive.
Which tells you everything about the mood in the country.
When an authoritarian state demands total political submission, the implicit trade-off is supposed to be safety and stability.
The moment the public believes the state is the primary architect of their physical destruction, that contract is fundamentally broken. There is no longer any incentive to comply.
And that breakdown is cemented just weeks later on Black Friday in Jaleh Square in Tehran.
Yeah, where troops opened fire on a massive crowd that had gathered, seemingly unaware that martial law had been declared that morning.
And the official death toll was around 95. But street rumors rapidly inflated it to thousands.
It completely alienated whatever was left of the middle class. They realized the state's monopoly on violence wasn't protecting the nation. It was solely protecting the monarch. But this brings up a massive historical paradox, right? The Shah had spent billions of oil dollars building one of the most advanced, heavily armed militaries in the world. Why couldn't this massive military apparatus simply shut the revolution down by force?
Well, the military was fundamentally a paper tiger. It was incredibly top-heavy, led by generals who were paralyzed without the Shah's explicit, confident orders.
Oh, back to the 6 CEO analogy.
Exactly. But more importantly, look at the rank and file. The troops deployed in the streets were mostly rural conscripts. They were farm boys and recent urban immigrants doing their mandatory 2-year military service.
And the protesters recognized this. They launched a devastatingly effective psychological warfare campaign.
Instead of just throwing rocks, they started fraternizing with the soldiers.
I remember this from the text. They walked right up to the military lines and put carnations into the barrels of the soldiers' rifles.
Chanting, "My brother in uniform, why fratricide?"
You are asking a young conscript from a deeply religious working-class background to shoot into a crowd of people who look just like his parents and siblings.
People who were carrying the Quran and chanting about Islamic justice.
The soldiers simply lost the will to pull the trigger. Military discipline began to evaporate on the streets.
And facing this disintegration, the regime made another baffling strategic choice.
Right.
They decided they needed to cut off Khomeini's influence at the source. He had been living in exile in the Najaf, Iraq.
So the Shah pressured Saddam Hussein, who was then the vice president of Iraq, to expel Khomeini.
The regime's assumption was that forcing him out of the region would cause him to wander off into political obscurity.
They essentially dropped him at the Kuwaiti border. Kuwait refused him entry, and eventually he boarded a plane to France. Here's where it gets really interesting. They sent him to a quiet suburb of Paris called Neauphle-le-Château. And by doing so, the Shah's regime accidentally hands Khomeini the biggest megaphone on planet Earth.
It completely backfired.
In Iraq, Khomeini was relatively isolated from the global press. In Paris, he is a short drive from every major international news bureau in Europe.
The optics of this setup are a PR masterstroke.
You have Western journalists completely used to dealing with politicians in tailored suits driving out to this French suburb.
Yeah.
And there sits this 76-year-old Ayatollah, cross-legged on a blanket under an apple tree, calmly sipping tea. He's wearing a simple black robe and a turban. He looks completely ascetic, entirely devoid of any material corruption.
And then the evening news cuts directly to the Shah in Tehran, sitting in an opulent palace, wearing a military uniform literally dripping with gold fringes and medals.
The visual contrast alone did massive damage to the regime's international and domestic standing.
And Khomeini played the global media beautifully. He gave deceptively simple answers, speaking broadly about freedom and democracy.
While carefully avoiding the rigid specifics of his religious political theories.
Right. He united the Iranian secularists, the leftists, the university students, and the religious poor by serving as a blank screen. They could all project their own specific hopes for a post-Shah Iran onto him.
And it culminates in January 1979. The Shah, weeping on the tarmac, boards an airplane and flees the country. The newspaper headlines simply read, "Shah raft. The Shah left."
Millions of people flood the streets in sheer joy.
And a few weeks later, Khomeini returns to Tehran to a welcome of millions. The military formally declares neutrality and orders its troops back to their barracks.
The crowds loot the armories, and the regime simply vanishes.
Just like that, the old structure was gone, and Khomeini had an entirely different architectural blueprint ready to deploy.
One that required a total theological flip of Shia tradition.
Wait, so traditionally they didn't rule?
Right. Historically, Orthodox Shia clerics practiced strict political quietism.
Meaning what, exactly?
Their deeply held belief was that all temporal government is inherently flawed, corrupt, and somewhat illegitimate in the absence of the 12th Imam the Mahdi.
Who is an occultation and will only return at the end of times to bring true justice.
Exactly. The clerics believed their job was to study jurisprudence, guide the faithful spiritually, and intentionally stay out of the dirty business of running a state.
The traditional stance was basically, you guys handle the taxes and the roads, we'll handle the soul.
Yeah, that sums it up. But Khomeini took that quietism and flipped it by radically reinterpreting a dry, centuries-old legal concept called wilayat-e-faqih.
The guardianship of the jurist?
Right. Traditionally, this was just a localized fiduciary duty. If a child was orphaned or someone was mentally incapacitated and had no family to rely on, the Islamic jurist acted as their guardian to manage their affairs.
So it was like being an executor of an estate or a social worker.
Yeah. But Khomeini took that localized power of attorney and expanded it exponentially into absolute political sovereignty over the entire nation.
Wow.
In his lectures in his foundational book, Islamic Government, he argued that Muslims couldn't just sit around praying in the mosque while Western colonial power stole their oil, corrupted their culture, and dictated their foreign policy.
He's basically telling the clerical establishment, the house is on fire and you're refusing to grab a bucket because you're waiting for the fire chief to arrive.
That's spot on. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Khomeini argued that because the 12th Imam is absent, someone has to actively enforce Islamic law and protect the community right now.
And who is better qualified to run an Islamic society than the most learned experts in Islamic law?
He insisted that the jurist must rule. And he combined this audacious theological shift with a brilliant political strategy to mobilize the masses. He co-opted the language of the Marxist left.
Because Iran had a very active, highly intellectual left-wing movement, right?
Oh, very active. They organized around concepts of class struggle, the proletariat, and the bourgeoisie.
And Khomeini stole their talking points and wrapped them in the authority of the Quran.
Yes, he started utilizing the specific Quranic term, mostazifin, the disinherited of the earth.
It echoed Frantz Fanon and the global socialist rhetoric of the time, but Khomeini gave it a divine Islamic mandate.
He wasn't just talking about a Marxist class struggle over factory wages. He framed the revolution as a cosmic holy war between the oppressed, righteous masses and the corrupt, idol-worshipping elites, the Taghut.
He completely outmaneuvered the actual Marxist guerrillas by giving class warfare a religious soul.
And co-opting that language allowed Khomeini to build a massive, diverse coalition to topple the Shah. He used the umbrella slogan, all together.
Allying with secular nationalists, lay Islamists, liberals, and Marxists.
But that created a massive post-revolution power struggle. He now had to share a newly liberated country with the secularists and Marxists he had just ideologically outmaneuvered.
Which brings us to the deeply tragic figures of the revolution, the moderates. People like Mahdi Bazargan, who became the first prime minister of the provisional government. These were highly educated, experienced politicians. Many had studied in Europe and had long histories of opposing the Shah.
And they genuinely believed they were using Khomeini as a figurehead.
They thought he would be their spiritual guide, residing quietly in the holy city of Qom while they stayed in Tehran to build a modern democratic republic with a respectable Islamic veneer.
This raises an important question, though. How did seasoned, intelligent politicians miscalculate so badly?
Right.
They fundamentally underestimated the structural power Khomeini was building behind the scenes. While the moderates were trying to run the formal, decaying ministries of the old state, Khomeini's inner clerical core was establishing parallel institutions.
Like the Revolutionary Guards.
Exactly. A fiercely loyal, ideologically driven paramilitary force specifically designed to bypass and eventually dismantle the regular army.
To Khomeini and his inner circle, these tie-wearing French-speaking moderates were merely useful tools. They were the perfect, respectable faces to put on television to calm the Western media during the turbulent transition.
But they were always outsiders to the core project.
Once the Shah was gone, the regular military was neutralized and the Revolutionary Guards were heavily armed. The all-together coalition was no longer necessary.
The moderates were quickly branded as compromising liberals.
The dark irony is staggering. The men who helped build the revolution, the men who translated for Khomeini in Paris, the men who legitimized him to the Iranian middle class, within months or a few short years, they were systematically sidelined, forced to resign, exiled, or sent to the gallows.
The revolution devoured its own architects to leave only the clerical core standing.
The moderates wanted a political transition.
And Khomeini wanted a total societal transformation.
Yeah.
And he had the tight, neighborhood-level network of mosques and mourning associations to enforce his will.
Proving that in the vacuum of a collapsed state, the group with the most ruthless clarity of purpose and the tightest grassroots organization almost always consumes the rest of the coalition.
Absolutely.
So why does this history matter to you listening to this today? Because it is a profound, terrifyingly clear lesson in how fragile, complex systems actually are. When a government loses its legitimacy, when the people fundamentally stop believing in the story the state tells about itself, all the tanks and secret police in the world cannot save it.
It's also a stark warning about the dynamics of revolutions. They almost always require broad, messy, contradictory coalitions to succeed.
You need the liberals, the leftists, and the religious conservatives all pushing the same wall to bring it down.
But those coalitions rarely survive the morning after the victory.
We started with a confident, heavily militarized monarchy operating as an island of stability. But it was undone by its own structural rigidity, a dying micromanaging leader, and the explosive, unintended consequences of trying to suppress dissent.
Waiting in the wings was a brilliant, uncompromising cleric who managed to rewrite centuries of religious tradition, unite completely disparate enemies under a single banner, and build a brand new theocratic reality out of the ashes.
So what does this all mean? It means history can turn on a dime. It's driven by the raw power of ideas, the mathematical rhythm of culture, and the catastrophic consequences of a broken social contract.
I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder.
Go ahead.
The 1979 revolution was a massive popular uprising that successfully replaced an absolute monarch with an absolute supreme leader. It makes you wonder, when a society overthrows a deeply ingrained, centuries-old system of absolute power, are they truly dismantling the architecture of that power? Or, in the chaos of revolution, are they just changing the clothes of the person wielding it?
Wow, that is a haunting question. It brings us right back to the beginning. When that high-pressure boiler shatters, you have to look really closely at the new machine they build in its place. Because sometimes the new vessel is forged using the exact same blueprints as the old one, just painted a different color. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives of history. Look for the hidden pressure points in the structures around you, and we'll see you next time.